Hello, Andrew here, and today we're up to episode 159, and we're looking at the parable of the wedding banquet. We pick this up in Matthew chapter 22 now, verses 1 through to 14, and it's worth noticing before we start this, that this is the final parable of this little group of parables that we've been dealing with over the last few episodes, where Jesus is directly addressing the religious leaders, the chief priests and the scribes of the temple, who have challenged his authority to take up space in the temple and basically cleanse it out of the money changers and merchants, and to be using it as a place where people are healed and where he's taking up space teaching people. So we pick up the narrative at Matthew chapter 22 verse 1. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who'd been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who've been invited, look, I've prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed these murderers and burnt their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' These slaves went out into the streets and gathered all they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" I love that word, gnashing. Anyway, probably shouldn't. At first glance, this is a potentially challenging story. The hoi polloi being invited to a feast and deciding they had better things to do. Some of the messengers being killed, and in turn a slaughter being perpetrated by an enraged king. Common people being called in from the highways and byways, and someone being tied hand and foot and cast out into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Because many are called, but few are chosen. Now I don't know if you can see it, but there's potentially some problems with quite a bit of it. And this is a picture of the kingdom of heaven. So let's get started. First, the king sends out invitations. Jesus is here talking, as I said before, to the religious leaders in Israel. They are supposed to discern that this is referring to them. They're the ones who have received these original invitations. They're being invited to the wedding feast of the crown prince. Apparently, they were not impressed, either with the king, his son, or the prospect of attending a wedding feast with him at all. It may be that they can see no real advantage is in this for them. Remember, Jesus is talking about a model of the kingdom of heaven. There's nowhere here for them to enhance their own position, because they know that this king and his kingdom are not into that sort of thing. This king treats everyone ultimately the same. So they find excuses not to show. For some, though, they make sport of the messengers. They abuse them and kill some of them. Why? Because they feel like it. It seemed like fun at the time. And because they can. The king is very upset at the treatment of his slaves, understandably, because they had no choice in the matter. They were merely carrying out the king's instructions to issue invitations to a party. They had no choice about this at all. They were slaves. They were doing simply what the king had instructed them to do. And now they'd been murdered for it. Now this is the first century. They had no extended prison terms for these heartless and amoral souls. So they're taken out by the king's soldiers and their properties are burnt to the ground. I have to admit, it's difficult to have too much sympathy for them. People who get enjoyment out of the misery of others. Not so much. It's worth noticing now, though, that the Greek word used here for invite is the word kaleo. Kaleo means to call, to invite, to summons. Here's the thing. It was clearly understood in the day that the strength of the word and what it actually meant depended on who was doing the calling, the inviting, or the summonsing. A friend would kaleo, would invite. You could have a choice. One could say yes, one could say no. A king, on the other hand, when a king kaleoed, let's just mangle it a little bit, when the king kaleoed, it was a summons. One actually didn't have a choice when a king offered an invitation. It wasn't like you could say yes or no. You were expected to be there. Yet these people thumbed their noses. First, even if it was a friend, they all had more important things to do. And it's clear that the kind of the person that the king was, this generous, open, sharing kind of king, wasn't the kind of friend that they would have wanted. For them, who wants to go to his stinking party? He's not much of a king, and we don't think much of his son either. It's all highly offensive. So what does the king do? Well, he just turns aside from them. He sends out his servants, he sends out his slaves into the highways and byways and draw in as many people as who would come. I imagine them looking under the hedges and grabbing out the beggars and the tramps and dragging them all in. Many might come simply because they're looking for a good feed. They've got empty tummies and they just want to fill them. It didn't matter. They came. The bad and the good. And I think actually in the original, it's the bad that comes first. The bad and the good. They all come. That's what we read there. There were no other criteria. All that mattered was that they were willing to say yes to the invitation. No other criteria. They didn't have to be good enough. They didn't have to be holy enough. They didn't have to be powerful enough or rich enough or smart or well educated enough. They didn't have to be well connected enough or gifted enough or talented enough or beautiful or handsome enough. They didn't even have to be white enough. They didn't have to be doctrinally pure enough or politically aligned enough. None of these things mattered. There were no categories that could exclude them. All that was required was that they were willing to say yes to the invitation. Wow. Think about that for a moment. No other categories. They just had to say yes. It reminds me of Dallas Willard, again. Heard him saying, and I've said this before, that he believed that everyone will be in heaven who can possibly stand being there. I think he's right. I think we get a picture of this here. And so the king's banqueting hall was filled. And in comes the king. And he spots a problem. There was someone there who wasn't wearing the correct clothes for the wedding. So I conclude with the Amplified Version that these garments were actually provided by the king. All the person had to do was put them on. Nothing else. Everything was provided. Everything. And there's potentially a whole message here about putting on Christ, which I'm not going to do today. But you get the picture. Everything's provided. But this man refuses. He won't put on the garments, the wedding garments, these beautiful garments that cover all of what's underneath. He refuses. I have a friend of many years ago who was very intelligent and gifted. He'd gone to university, he'd studied to be an engineer, and he applied for jobs. This was, 45 years ago. He had long dreadlock hair. He was applying to professional firms for a job. He couldn't find one. I said to him, "You need to cut your hair." His response was, "They have to accept me as I am." I said to him, "They don't have to accept you at all." And they didn't. In all the years since, he's never had any kind of long-term full-time job. Here's this man coming saying, "The king has to accept me as I am." The king does not have to accept him as he is. Actually, as he is, he's not going to be happy here. So what does he do? He has him cast into the out of darkness where there is that wailing and gnashing of teeth. So who's doing this? Well, it's all the people who think it's all so unfair that they've been excluded and who wanted it all on their own terms. They're the ones who are out there. The thing is that it doesn't work like that. The kingdom of heaven we're discovering is for team players. This is a bit of a challenge for me because I'm not particularly a great team player. But that's what it's for. So many are called. Many are invited. Many are summoned. We all are. But few are the chosen ones. And of course the Calvinists get on this and say, "Yeah, there we are. It's God's elect." But who chose them? I want us to notice that they're self-selecting. They chose themselves. And the ones who refused to come were also self-selecting. They chose themselves also to be elsewhere. Because this event wasn't going to elevate, I suggest, their sense of self-importance. So they didn't show. The ones who said yes were the chosen ones. The ones who are willing to say, "I'm up for this." Those who said no, if I can't have it on my own terms, I'm not having it at all, they didn't show. Which is just as well. Because there's probably no room for them in the kingdom. Tragic, but true. Well, friends, I hope you found this interesting and useful. God bless you.